Okay, super. Okay. I was actually saying that some of the stuff, some of the work that has been done by One Future Collective in the time of the pandemic, especially early pandemic, right? And is was in fact fit into the principles of mutual aid, right? So I just wanted to understand a little bit about how did those ideas come about, and what kinds of programs did you then begin to run, especially during the pandemic?
Right. Now, those are such great questions. I think we stopped working in person in March itself. So even before a lockdown was implemented by the government, we had already actually started planning for a lockdown for the team, which I think was helpful. I think a little bit of pre-planning in terms of a pandemic was helpful. We'd also been tracking this for a few months before the pandemic actually hit the country. So I think our preparedness in certain terms was higher, but I don't think we could have imagined the sort of impact it would have had on the country or on the communities we serve. Any of it, right? It was massive. Like I have not seen this sort of despair amongst people ever, and I've been doing this work for a while, and I've just never seen it. However, when it hit us, when the pandemic hit, I think we rallied on two fronts. One was, what does this mean for the team? And what does this mean for the work that we do? We also follow funding models that are not necessarily grant based, right? So we look at community based funding, we look at revenue generation, things like that. So one of the key things for me was how to ensure that we have enough money to pay salaries for X number of months, because the last thing I wanted to do was let go of people during like a global crisis. So I think thinking of social security measures for your own employees, especially because I feel like in the non-profit space, so much of that does not exist. There are none of these benefits, none of these pension schemes, none of that is there. Not even like health insurance. Like how many non-profits provide health insurance? We don't. But we have started employees. Anyway, so we started with that. And then we thought about what we're good at, right? We thought about what are we good at? What do we have capacity to provide? And then we planned what is our response going to be like outside of the organization. One thing we realized is that, okay, we're good at our knowledge programs, we're good at our leadership programs. So we continue to do them virtually. And we realized that that's a great way for us to raise funds, fund our other programs, because no one's giving us money for like giving ration to a community that we would first work with on a leadership program, right? But now those kids no longer need me to come into a leadership program. They need like an electronic device, they need food, they need recharges to ensure that they can stay in class, that they can have food, that they can sometimes even just have shelter over their heads. And instead of just raising donations, we committed a certain percentage of revenue generation towards that as well. Because donations were coming in, but they were also coming in for certain communities, right? Like we also work with sex worker communities, we work with transgender communities. Donations don't come in as easily when you're working in certain. When I say I want to ensure that a survivor of domestic violence has a house to escape to, no one's giving me money for that. So where does that fund come from? So that's where we started from, like capitalizing on what we're good at. And then also recognizing what are gaps that we can fill that we are good at and maybe others are not looking at. And I think a couple of things that came up for us there was mental health, feminist justice, especially for survivors of sexual and gender based violence. So this could be women, but it would also include a lot of queer identities, um, maybe at home, maybe otherwise, right? And a range of issues that they may be facing. And we realize that these are two things that we're good at, we have existing communities in, and we know what to do. So we know what sort of support to do. We have our networks with local organizations, we have our networks with lawyers, with mental health, and we pivoted to providing that sort of support. I will say that in the first 3 to 6 months of the pandemic, it was not so planned. It was very much like if someone from our community approaches us, and I use the term community loosely, anyone we've ever worked with, right, in our lives, not just me, not just the team, but like individually, if a team member has ever worked, even at a previous job with someone, and then someone reaches out to them, we did not say no. So I know that for the first months we did not say no. We rallied all resources we had, from I think paying fees for people, um, to ration, to like sanitary napkins, whatever it was. And I just don't see any of this as giving. I feel like a lot of it is just redistribution of what it's meant to be. Because it's so unfortunate that so many of us who may be part of like the knowledge labor economy continued to make money, even at the time when the world was in crisis, right? And then there were so many people whose labor might even be essential for day-to-day functioning, but there was absolutely no compensation. Like I think about even today, and even about, does the guy really want to deliver food to my house, or does he have no other option? Right. So these were a lot of the thoughts in the like at the top of our head. We also ensured that domestic workers were paid, at least in our households, at least in our communities. We tried to, a lot of it was so ad hoc that I can't give a structure to it, but we tried to find domestic workers who'd been let go by their employers, who were not being paid salaries by employers. Even things like, the fruit or vegetable vendor you buy your things from. And I learned so much of this from my mother also. Like my mother called up the beautician who comes home sometimes, and she had no income. And when my mother called her, she told my mother that I go to like 30, 40 houses, but you were the only one who called me to ask if I need money without providing services. She said others would avoid my call because they would think I wanted money. And I think I learned a lot of that. These are communities that I wouldn't even think of sometimes as my community, but they are my people. They are people I have different sorts of relationships with. And I did this, the team did this. We mapped out our like local people, whoever needed support, apart from the programmatic stuff we did, right? A lot of this was ad hoc, and we were able to mobilize a large amount, I think near a crore in terms of that was redistributed through this. And this is all that I could track. There's a bunch of it that, you can't even track, like 10,000 here, 5,000 here. And a lot of times, so we're not big on like you have to donate to us, then we will give it ahead. But like this person needs it, can you just directly pay in there? So a lot of times it's not gone through us, so we can't even track it. In fact, 80-90% of the time we don't take it to us. So a lot of that has gone ahead. So in terms of that, resourcing that. And then when the second wave hit, I think we realized how much COVID workers needed support. So we launched a mental health project that focused on COVID workers, but also provided support to allied persons. And then, of course, a lot of our families work. So we've had to help survivors leave abusive situations during COVID. For I stopped my really long time after so such a small thing, right? Like shelter during COVID, you needed a COVID negative test. But to get a COVID negative test, you need your Aadhaar card. Now, any woman who's in a situation, or any poor kid or anyone, they don't have their Aadhaar card. Government documents are often the hardest to get when you're in an abusive situation because they're being controlled by the abuser. And this is a small, maybe design flaw, but no one thought about it. Governments didn't think about it. I have called up police officials, and police officials have told me things like, 20 साल से मार खा रहे हैं 20 दिन और खा लेंगे तो क्या फर्क पड़ता है? Like they've been beaten up for 20 years. How does it matter if it's 20 more days? The challenges are such that I don't know how to respond. I'm being very honest. Whatever has happened by a mix of luck. Sometimes like even risking people, right? Because we have risked people to bring in someone without a COVID test or into a friend's house or into, any stranger who's like, I will figure out a way and I will keep them in the house. I think a lot of that, I don't know if it's mutual aid. I don't know if it's a smart thing to do. But I just don't say no to someone who needs to leave in a abusive situation. And yeah, I don't know where it falls in terms of programming, but
No, I mean, and it's so interesting is also that a lot of the mutual aid language hasn't really entered India yet, right? In terms of just us using it in our everyday, but and so much of what you're saying is in many ways what we would call mutual aid, right? And mutual aid efforts globally have been saying we need to go local, right? We need to be communities in our spaces because the larger federal structures, the bigger structures are failing us, right? And are failing these very communities that they are meant to quote unquote serve, right? And that I think is really what we saw in both the first wave and the second wave in India, right? In terms of what the communities that were to be protected were the communities that were not protected in the process, right? And I think that that is something for us to really think about in terms of our responses going forward. And I think some of the things that you say, we had this question somebody had raised while we were talking about mutual aid on our page these past few days, like how do you do it, right? Like how do you build these spaces? Like what do we do because we want to do? And that was something that during my time volunteering in the second wave, that was something that I really did see. People really wanted to do, right? But it's also that there's not enough of knowing what to do, right? And how to do, right? And it was in many ways, I remember in the early part of the second wave, it was fundraisers were getting met in no time, right? Because of the fact that people were just donating because of the sheer distress that they were seeing everywhere, you know. And we were, like you're saying, a lot of the fundraisers that I was able to coordinate as part of Mutual Aid India, was one of the things that we noticed was people were not asking for proof. They knew that distress was high, and they just were channeling that amount somewhere, right? And I think that that is also interesting in terms of what when about the ways in which we function in disasters and in as a relief response, right?
Right.
But what does it mean in many ways to build this in our everyday lives, right? Like for the people around us every day. Like if it's not a disaster situation, how do we build these communities of aid and care, you know? And what does that even look like sometimes, you know? And I was thinking about this recently, and somebody was sharing. But when I lived in Bombay, we would often share food in the building, right? So it began as I was in attempting to learn how to bake. So I baked a lot and multiple tests and failures, etc. So I would give it to the women in the building that I knew, like who I had engaged with on the staircase, etc. And initially, it was very odd for them because it was not something that maybe they had seen somebody of my age do or whatever else, right? And then over a period of time, food began to come from their house, you know, and the familiarity, right, of knowing that you can send food to this person's house, right? And then I learned that they don't eat eggs on Saturdays or something like those kinds of things. You learn from that, and I think some of those structures have also failed in terms of our cities itself, right? Like we don't really know people around us. We are not on, like you were sharing, who is our community is not something that we who counts as community is something that really is a question that we must be asking ourselves, right? Yeah.
No, those are
Yeah.
such good.
Yeah, and I think what somebody's also saying, and one of our co-founders is saying, and the thing is that so much of the work that we do often doesn't have the language, right? Like I think, I mean, and all the stuff that I have been reading about mutual aid, and I think, and I keep sitting back to think, it at the core, it is to say that let's be kind to each other, like let's give and redistribute and be present with each other in that very local idea, you know. And so that is something that you have been seeing at One Future Collective and the work that you have been doing, right? Yeah. In sorry, continue.
No, but just agreeing. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I mean, it just brings me to ask a little bit more about the sort of response you saw from the community, right? In terms of these actions and aids, right? And in my experience, that has been something that has shifted, right? But like you were also saying that the nonprofit sector in many ways doesn't necessarily have some of this language, right? And so what does it mean then for us to build these kinds of spaces, even in small or big ways, large ways, whichever ways?
No, these are great questions. I'm going to answer them a little backwards. I would rather that the nonprofit sector does not have this language. I'm concerned for what happens when we start using the language but not the actions. I don't think mutual aid is something that NGOs can do. I think mutual aid is something that people do. I don't think NGOs in the world know how to function in a way where they don't collectivize power and resources. And maybe over time we will learn, but I don't think that's something that, why take it there when people can lead it, right? People can lead these movements without needing a non-profit or the idea of an institution managing this sort of work. So I think that's for the latter half. I think in the first half, I saw such beautiful responses. So we launched the One Future Festival and we held it in April. And we held the festival as a space for healing and just care and things like that. And we asked people to donate if they could. It was a free festival. And the money they donated would go towards the COVID project that we were running on mental health. And I have gotten, and the beautiful part is we've gotten donations of 50 rupees, of 100 rupees. And that makes me so happy because this is like a 17-year-old somewhere giving me money, or like a 23-year-old young professional just starting out work, and not often from the most privileged backgrounds, right? Because knowing the sort of donors we've had donors come from backgrounds where giving that 500 rupees is a struggle. But I have seen them give that money. And then, of course, like there's been a lot of response from different partners. So there have been large supporters within India. People I've vaguely known, right, who've given like a large sum of money. Friends and family and people who I thought just don't get it, who were messaging me to ask, how do I give money? Because I think the second wave was so bad that each of us felt it. It comes from a place of privilege because the first wave was as bad. It just it didn't happen on social media. The second wave happened on like Twitter, where everyone was like scrambling for oxygen, scrambling for medicines. It happened the first time round too. It's just we didn't maybe see it as much face to face, but I think it led to a heightened sense of people giving. So that's what we saw in our communities. Our communities are primarily young people from different backgrounds, so class, caste, religion, gender, very different backgrounds. Across board, we had them give. People gave in terms of time, people gave in terms of money, people gave in terms of like connection with other resources, even just by doing the same work or by replicating this work in their communities. So they did give that way as well, and I thought that was beautiful. Otherwise, I would say that I have had a few interactions where someone's asked us photos for like therapy. And we're like, what photo can we provide as proof for therapy, right? So it's not like people completely let go of that. We were just like, don't donate. Like, I can't provide you photos of people in therapy. Again, to go back to mutual aid and how that would come out here, I think it was lovely that communities we formed as a result of our project become self-reliant in a way, like the community in itself. They are there for each other emotionally, in terms of sickness, even things like just working together on something if needed. Um, like even providing food to others, like you said. Maybe someone's got COVID and they're alone in the city, and then someone else steps up to send food. Right? Or if someone can't afford their fees for that year, our community has rallied to send them food. We had one case, COVID volunteers did not have money for their ration, and we raised money for ration for like 50 COVID volunteers. We raised money for a bunch of transports to get access to HRT, right? Like, and it happened so organically. There was no one leading. Like, there would be a volunteer from within the project saying, "I reached out to this person for something else, but now we have to lead." And it would just organically happen. And I feel that's one of the beautiful parts of mutual aid. It does not have a leadership model where someone's at the center. And I think that's what's worked so well. It creates a deep sense of ownership because no one's telling you to do something, you're doing it because you want to.
I mean, it sounds so much like collectively determining what we need, right?
Right.
And I think that is something that is a failure of so many of the systems, including the nonprofit system, right? Like, who is making these decisions about who gets the money, who gets to keep it, and who decides the criteria for what works or what doesn't, right? And I think that is something uh, we saw a lot, because I mean, you were speaking and I was thinking of all the things we saw during the second wave, right? Like, so many women sending food to COVID affected families because that was something to do. Lots of people sheltering cats and dogs because their families had COVID, right? And I think that some of these thoughts also make us think about how communities do rise up and in times of disasters to respond to the crisis, right? But my question is, how do we sustain some of this, right? And and that is something that happens over a period of time, I'm sure. But it's just a question about how have you all been seeing it pan out in your communities?
Yeah. So when you shared that earlier as well, it got me thinking, and I feel like this first step for us has been a certain amount of humility and a certain amount of just acknowledging that I need community. I don't know what it is, but over the last few decades, I feel like we've been taught that it's cooler and more comfortable to say I don't need people. And I don't say need people in the sense where I want to be with people all the time, right? So I could be an introvert, an extrovert, whatever. I don't mean people in the sense of being present always, but the fact that you will need people to rely upon, you will need people to take care of you when you're sick. And I think it starts from that place of acknowledging that I do need this. I want care and that I deserve to be cared for and that I want to provide care. I think both of these mindsets are just so difficult to just believe, right? Like, when was the last time you looked at someone and said, I would like to care for this person? Or I would want to be cared for in this way. Do we even have that? So I think for individuals, at an individual level, it's really important for us to acknowledge that we need this and to acknowledge it fairly, like publicly, which means to do it with your friends, to do it with your family. I know so many people who are spending lonely evenings, but it takes so much to message someone to say, I'm just free and bored and alone and I would like some company. So I think starting from that place, but that's fairly individualistic, right? And not everything can be solved at an individual level. I think at the other level, there needs to be very sustained, intentional effort to develop these communities. It could be around activities, like it could be around hobbies you have, it could be around volunteering work you do, it could be at your workplace, wherever it is. I think just investing in developing a community beyond a transactional function, like thinking of relationships not as transactional but as relational, and to enter into any sort of engagement in any relationship as I want a relationship with this person and I don't want XYZ from this person. I think that mindset shift for groups is extremely pertinent to get us to a place where communities can exist. I have dance classes where my community is so strong, and there are people I virtually learned dance with over the last few months, right? Or like maybe I took a language class and my community there is strong, or maybe I volunteer at the same organization. Something, and I'll share from my example of something that's really worked. And I will go back to like older generations. I find that in my building, like you said, Shai, older women do this so well. They automatically form communities and bonds with women that are there in their building. They automatically set up caregiving relationships. During the pandemic, when my mother was unwell, her friends were willing to risk COVID to just get her food that she likes to eat. And that was so beautiful to see. And these are not friends that are like, they're not old friends. They're just people we know from the building. And I think developing that intentionally. And I think last is a little bit of like hyper localization of these communities. We will make friends, right? We'll make friends at school, we'll make friends at college, at work. but they're not always going to live where you live. They will keep moving. I think each of us needs to develop more local relationships, and there need to be more local community building efforts. This could be in the form of just a space that says we want to develop communities. That's it, right? I think that would really help. Um, I I did this experiment thing with a group of young people earlier this year, and it was successful. So if you're listening, I'll share it. Um, I asked people to develop their care. No, as anyone listening in, I asked them to develop their care manifesto, which is how would you like to receive care and how would you like to give care. And these were questions that people had never like really sat down with, right? Maybe for me, care is we talk once in 2 months. Maybe for me, care is if I'm sick, you take care of me. Having that clarity for yourself will also help you engage in relationships so much more honestly, be it your friends, be it family, or be it new people sort of meeting. Yeah, so I think these are some ways to intentionally do it in the in between periods between disasters, because I feel like a lot of disasters wouldn't happen if these communities existed. I feel like if we just thought about care, right? If you think of it at a country level or at a global level, if we did not think about finance and we thought about care, then we wouldn't keep opening up again and again. But we would rather think of social security. Our response would not be that, oh, but people will starve. Our response would be we will find ways to ensure they don't, but we will ensure everyone stays home and it's safe. Yeah, so I think our response to crisis would change as well.
Oh, so many interesting things you've said in that response, Vandita. Thank you for sharing all of that. But I think what really stays with me is this also this idea of uh, what do we do in between disasters, right? In terms of, I mean, let me use crisis also, right? Like, because a lot of times, even in personal emergencies and crisis, I see that communities of care get built um, around the person that is having the crisis, right? But sustaining that is something that's really hard, you know. And while you were speaking, I was thinking a couple of maybe a year and a half ago, before the pandemic, I had done the exercise where you map who you would turn to in the city, who you would turn to for care, for support, for other kinds of things, but different kinds of aid, care, support in multiple ways, right? Like financial, emotional, intimate, etc. And one of the things that really stood out in my own mapping of that was how much of my own care network is virtual, you know, and not necessarily in the same city as me, you know. But I mean, I know that doesn't, it hasn't necessarily restricted my care network, but it has its own limitations in certain periods, right? and and that's something that really is really something that you think about, right? Like, who do you turn to when the crisis is local, right? In terms of, and this was something that during the lockdown in the pandemic, I felt very acutely because I was living alone with my cats, you know. And I was like, okay, I have the cats, so I have survived. You know, but you would not know what to do if you have no. And so many people have been sharing this idea of walking on the road even during lockdowns with somebody who, you know, right? Building that sort of community in your neighborhood, you know, and what that means for us going forward, you know. I mean, I'm thinking of all of this while you were speaking, just in terms of also that I think often when people see the word mutual aid, it comes across as something that's financial, right? And not necessarily the act of building that space, that safe space for people to come together, you know. And it reminds me of all the spaces that have been created in this time around communities of care that you have built around. I see posts about Mondays and Wednesdays where people come together to to speak, support groups, care groups, whatever we call them, right? And what has that had I mean, what kind of effect has that had for this in between this crisis moments, let's say?
Thank you for that question. I feel like I don't know if I would make a distinction definitely between support groups and care groups right now, because I do think they've gotten really blurry. I do see, like, from a support group, like a sharing session, people may be watching something together on Netflix or someone sending someone else ice cream. So I do think those lines are a little bit more blurry than in a pre-COVID world we would have even allowed for them to be. My experience with them has been that they're very, very affirming. Um, for example, I run a liberation circle, which is focused around like fat bodies. And we had a meetup yesterday, and it's supposed to end in an hour, and it didn't. And it just felt so good to be able to speak to other people who have similar feelings. Nothing else, right? Like experiences, everything may be similar, may not be, but we had similar feelings. And to be able to rely on each other for that sort of emotional support, I think that is beautiful. I think it's something that is so missing in our lives. I don't know if we even do that with friends anymore, right? Like it's so easy to talk to friends about what's good and what's happening well, or like categorizing friendships and saying, oh, I talked to this friend about this and that friend about this. I feel like these sharing circles, all of which we've had, have allowed people to just be in the presence of others and expect and demand care. And I think that also transforms their relationship with other people in their lives, because it shows you the possibility of a reality where you say these things, right? Like you say things like, I need a hug, or I want to be cared for, or I would like for you to like make me some soup today. Like you said, mutual aid is not just financial. And I think being in such a space where this is an expectation of you, that you would share what you want, helps you even take that to other spaces. And I think that is very powerful. So, one element is what happens within those spaces, but the ripple effect of it goes on for quite a while. And we've seen this, so we run like a movement space where people just used to come together in the morning to have a dance party. And it quickly became a space for like morning affirmations, for talking about identity and art, culture, and it became such a warm space for people to be with each other. I think that was really nice.
And I think some of this is also coming back to the ideas of it being mutual, right? You give sometimes and you get sometimes, right? But you have to, like you have been articulating throughout this live, is that we have to be able to do both in many ways, right? And that is something that we struggle with in this space, right? I'm just checking if we have any other questions, etc. No, we
If I
don't
may
seem
just,
to.
if I may just make a
Sure,
quick,
sure.
perhaps closing comment on the mutuality
Mm-hmm.
part, I think it's also so imperative to realize that in most relationships there is always a give and take. But often your idea of who you are and where you're situated does not allow for you to see that. Or maybe your idea of what give and take looks like does not allow you to see what they're giving as something you're actually receiving. And yeah, just wanted to share that because I think it gets so stuck in financial or monetary transactions, even when you're thinking of mutual aid this way, it's quite important. Yeah.
Mm. No, it's great that you bring that up. Could you explain it a bit with an example? So,
I'm going to try, but I feel like, say between a boss and an employee or between two friends, somehow the language of give and take will become that if I if I took care of someone when they were sick, they now have to do the same for me. Or if I got them a gift on their birthday, they have to do the same for me. But I think mutual aid is also about not having that tally score in your mind where you're constantly balancing out what you give and take. Because to me, that takes away from the essence of mutual aid. It is to recognize that you can give in so many ways, right? Maybe I got my friend, maybe a friend got me an expensive gift, but I made them something, or I gave them my time, or I just like wished them in a way that like made their day. Those could all be ways to give back, and that doesn't always have to be this sort of mental balancing that we do. I think that's also a part of mutual aid for me. And then the idea of proportionality, right? You will be in relationships where you will not hold as much maybe social status or power as the other person. Maybe I just don't make as much money as the other person, or I don't have the same networks as the other person. So then do you have to give at a 50-50? To me, mutual aid is also about recognizing that maybe one person will give at 30 and one will give at 70 in some aspects of the relationship, because that's where they're situated. And often that anyway comes from a lot of privilege, right? Yeah. I don't know how much sense I made, but I think, yeah.
No, no, I mean, you made a lot of sense, and it's also reminding me of all my I work a lot on disability, so some of my disability justice work says some of this, right? That our needs are different.
Yeah.
That so you're not going to match each other's needs. That's not necessarily a useful way to understand collective care, right? But to imagine it as, like you're saying, as a fluid idea of give and take, and not so much as I gave you this much, you need to give me back this much, right? And I think that that is also a mentality shift for us, right? And so much of that is where the proof also sits, right? Like, I have given this much money, so I need to see the proof of this much money having had any value, right? And I think that that is a question we have to ask ourselves in terms of what is it that we are trying to do with care and support and aid for each other, right? In many ways. And I think that the pandemic has brought that question into our laps, so we must ask it more and more. Yeah. Do you have any closing comments? Otherwise, we can close.
No, I mean, no comments. I just want anyone who's listening to know that you can start like today. It's not some massive big thing that you need like external support for. You can start by like what they're mentioning around like pod mapping, mapping who your people are, mapping how you can provide support, maybe starting a solidarity giving circle. It could be a small thing, but if we don't take action, a lot of these conversations sometimes are of no consequence. So even if this just makes you reflect about your own like life and mutual aid, that would be great for me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think learning that we can all build not just communities, but that we already exist in a community. So facilitating the process is right there. Thank you so much, Vandita. This was absolutely fantastic and such a pleasure to speak to you and to listen to all the work that you're doing. I just want to leave as a message that One Future Collective does run support groups and listening circles and many community spaces. So it would be great if you feel like you need a space like this and you're willing to join them, then please do follow them, and you will be able to join the communities, be part of some of this, and we can all do this together. Yeah.
Thank you. That's so kind. I had a beautiful time. Thank you so much for having me. Take care.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah. Take care. Bye bye.
Bye.